Imagine sitting in a cold, dark cell, knowing that in just a few hours, you will take your last breath. Not because of what you've done, but because of a mistake, a failure of justice that no one will stop. The death penalty is meant for the guilty, but history has shown us chilling examples of innocent people sent to their deaths. These are the stories of 7 people, wrongly accused, condemned by flawed evidence, unreliable witnesses, and a system that refused to listen. From a 14-year-old boy electrocuted in the Jim Crow South to a man convicted on a single strand of hair later proven not to be his, these are the names of those who should have lived. Their stories will make you question everything you thought you knew about justice and how easily the system can get it wrong. Carlos DeLuna, executed for a crime he didn't commit. Carlos DeLuna was executed in 1989 in Texas for the murder of Wanda Lopez, a gas station clerk who was brutally stabbed to death. The case against him was built almost entirely on the testimony of a single eyewitness, despite a lack of forensic evidence linking him to the crime. DeLuna always maintained his innocence, repeatedly insisting that another man, Carlos Hernandez, was the real perpetrator. However, the authorities dismissed this claim, and he was sent to his death despite glaring inconsistencies in the case. The crime occurred in Corpus Christi on February 4, 1983. Wanda Lopez, a young mother working the night shift at a gas station, called the police in fear as a man armed with a knife loomed over her. By the time officers arrived, she was dead, bleeding out from multiple stab wounds. Witnesses in the area described a suspect fleeing the scene, but the descriptions varied. A few blocks away, police found Carlos DeLuna hiding under a truck. He was quickly arrested and charged with the murder. From the outset, the case against DeLuna was weak. The prosecution argued that DeLuna acted alone, yet there was no physical evidence tying him to the crime scene. No blood, no fingerprints, no murder weapon. The only thing linking him to the crime was the testimony of a single eyewitness who saw a Hispanic man running from the gas station. The witness identified DeLuna in a highly flawed police lineup, even though he initially described a different-looking suspect. DeLuna, on the other hand, claimed he ran from the police out of fear because he had a prior record for petty crimes. He was adamant that Carlos Hernandez, a violent felon with a history of attacking women, was the real killer. Hernandez was well known to law enforcement, and unlike DeLuna, he had a history of using knives in violent crimes. He also frequently bragged to friends and fellow inmates that he had killed Wanda Lopez and that DeLuna had taken the fall for it. Despite this, the prosecution denied Hernandez's existence, telling the jury that he was a fabrication by DeLuna. It later turned out that not only was Hernandez real, but he had a rap sheet that included numerous stabbings. His own family members and associates confirmed that he often spoke about getting away with the murder of Wanda Lopez. Yet, none of this evidence was ever presented to the jury. DeLuna was convicted and sentenced to death based on a rushed and flawed investigation. His court-appointed defense did little to challenge the weak evidence, and the jury quickly found him guilty. Appeals were denied, and on December 7, 1989, Carlos DeLuna was executed by lethal injection. His last words maintained his innocence, as he told those gathered to watch his death that he had not killed Wanda Lopez. Years after DeLuna's execution, investigative journalists and legal experts began digging into his case, uncovering the many flaws that led to his wrongful conviction. The most damning evidence came from a study led by Columbia University law professor James Liebman, which concluded that DeLuna had been executed for a crime he did not commit. Their report found that Carlos Hernandez had almost certainly committed the murder, as he had continued to commit violent crimes after DeLuna's execution. One of the most disturbing aspects of the case was how authorities ignored the clear evidence of another suspect. The police did not investigate Hernandez, even though his violent reputation was known in the community. Prosecutors dismissed DeLuna's claims of innocence without ever looking into the alternate suspect. The defense failed to properly challenge the weak case against their client. The entire system seemed designed to convict quickly rather than to ensure justice was served. DeLuna's case has since been cited as one of the most egregious examples of wrongful execution in the United States. It highlights the dangers of the death penalty, particularly when cases rely on flawed eyewitness testimony and inadequate legal defense. It also raises troubling questions about how many other innocent people may have been put to death under similar circumstances. The state of Texas has never officially admitted to executing an innocent man in DeLuna's case, but the overwhelming evidence suggests that a grave injustice occurred. His wrongful execution remains a haunting reminder of the irreversible consequences of capital punishment. Many legal experts argue that had proper investigative work been done, had the courts taken a closer look at the evidence, and had Hernandez been properly investigated, DeLuna might still be alive today. Instead, the legal system failed him at every step, resulting in an irreversible mistake that can never be undone. Ruben Cantu, executed. Despite recanted testimony. Ruben Cantu was only 17 years old when he was convicted of a murder that would ultimately lead to his execution in Texas in 1993. His case stands as a stark example of how the justice system can fail, as it was built on the shaky foundation of a single eyewitness who later admitted he had been pressured into identifying Cantu. Despite this, the system moved forward with his execution, making him another tragic example of a wrongful death sentence. The crime in question took place in San Antonio, Texas in 1984. A robbery at a construction site ended in gunfire, leaving one man dead and another critically wounded. The surviving victim, Juan Moreno, initially told police he could not identify the shooter. However, months later, under police pressure, he changed his statement and accused Ruben Cantu of being the attacker. This new testimony became the backbone of the prosecution's case against Cantu, even though no physical evidence connected him to the crime. At the time of the murder, Cantu was already known to law enforcement for minor offenses, making him an easy target. Prosecutors painted him as a violent gang member with no regard for human life. However, there was no forensic evidence, no fingerprints, no murder weapon, and no motive linking Cantu to the shooting. The only thing tying him to the crime was Moreno's testimony, which was later revealed to have been coerced by police officers eager to close the case. Cantu's trial was deeply flawed from the beginning. His co-defendant, David Garza, who was also a teenager at the time, was pressured into taking a plea deal rather than going to trial. With no strong legal defense, Cantu was convicted based on Moreno's identification alone. The jury sentenced him to death, believing they were putting a dangerous criminal behind bars. Years later, long after Cantu had been executed, new evidence emerged that cast doubt on the entire case. The key eyewitness, Juan Moreno, came forward and admitted that he had been wrong. He revealed that police had pressured him into identifying Cantu, even though he had never actually seen the shooter's face. Moreno later expressed deep regret, saying, "They told me to pick him and I did. I was young and I was scared. I didn't know what else to do." Even more shocking was the revelation that law enforcement officials had doubts about Cantu's guilt before his execution, but had done nothing to stop it. Several police officers admitted years later that they had suspected Cantu was innocent, but no action was taken to prevent his death. One former judge who had worked on the case later said, "We killed an innocent man." Cantu was executed by lethal injection on August 24, 1993. He never stopped maintaining his innocence, and in his final words, he expressed no anger, only sadness that he was being put to death for a crime he didn't commit. His case has since been widely cited as one of the most egregious wrongful executions in U.S. history. What makes the story of Ruben Cantu especially tragic is how preventable his execution was. The justice system failed him at every level, from the investigation to the trial to the appeals process. The lack of physical evidence, the unreliable eyewitness testimony, and the police misconduct should have been enough to at least halt his execution. Yet, the system pushed forward, prioritizing closure over truth. Since Cantu's execution, his case has been reviewed by multiple legal experts and journalists, all of whom agree that his conviction was deeply flawed. Yet, there has been no official acknowledgement from the state of Texas that an innocent man was put to death. The case continues to serve as a chilling reminder of the risks of capital punishment and the irreversible consequences of getting it wrong. Had the justice system been more thorough, had the police been more ethical, and had the courts been more willing to listen to new evidence, Ruben Cantu might still be alive today. Instead, the failure of those in power to seek true justice led to his wrongful execution, one that can never be undone. Cameron Todd Willingham, executed for a fire that wasn't arson. Cameron Todd Willingham was executed in Texas in 2004 for a crime that never actually happened. He was convicted of setting a fire that killed his 3 young daughters, but years after his execution, independent investigations revealed that the fire was not arson at all. It was an accidental blaze. His case is now one of the most infamous examples of a wrongful execution in American history, showing how flawed forensic science and a rush to judgment can lead to irreversible mistakes. The fire occurred on December 23, 1991, in Corsicana, Texas. Willingham's home went up in flames while his 3 children, 2-year-old twins Carmen and Cameron, and their 1-year-old sister Amber, were trapped inside. Willingham escaped, but was unable to save his daughters. The grief-stricken father told authorities that he had no idea how the fire started. However, investigators quickly became suspicious of him. Within weeks, he was arrested and charged with arson and murder, despite there being no clear motive. The case against Willingham relied heavily on the testimony of fire investigators who claimed they found clear signs of arson. They pointed to burn patterns on the floor, crazed glass, which they wrongly believed indicated an intentionally set fire, and pour patterns that they said suggested an accelerant had been used. Prosecutors used these findings to argue that Willingham had deliberately set the fire to kill his children. They painted him as a violent, abusive man who saw his daughters as obstacles in his life. A jailhouse informant, Johnny Webb, also claimed that Willingham had confessed to the crime while behind bars. Despite maintaining his innocence from the beginning, Willingham was convicted in 1992 and sentenced to death. His trial was filled with problems. His court-appointed defense did little to challenge the flawed fire science presented by the prosecution. There was no physical evidence tying him to arson, no traces of gasoline on his clothing, no eyewitnesses seeing him set the fire, and no real motive beyond speculation. Yet the jury found him guilty, swayed by the dramatic accusations of prosecutors and the testimony of the jailhouse informant. Years later, as Willingham sat on death row, multiple independent fire experts reviewed the case and found that the original investigation had been based on outdated and flawed methods. The burn patterns and crazed glass, once considered evidence of arson, were actually common occurrences in accidental fires. In 2004, just months before his scheduled execution, the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles was given a report from renowned fire expert Gerald Hurst, who concluded that there was no scientific evidence to support the claim that the fire had been intentionally set. The report was ignored. On February 17, 2004, Cameron Todd Willingham was executed by lethal injection. In his final moments, he continued to assert his innocence, telling his ex-wife, who was present at the execution, that he had never hurt their children. In the years following his death, the case became a major controversy. The Texas Forensic Science Commission re-examined the fire investigation and found that the conclusions of arson investigators were based on junk science. The evidence that had been used to convict Willingham was entirely unreliable. Even the jailhouse informant who testified against him later recanted, admitting that he had lied in exchange for a reduced sentence. Despite overwhelming proof that Willingham was wrongly executed, Texas officials have refused to acknowledge their mistake. In 2009, Governor Rick Perry replaced members of the Texas Forensic Science Commission just as they were about to issue a report condemning the original fire investigation. This move was widely seen as an attempt to prevent the state from officially admitting that it had executed an innocent man. The case of Cameron Todd Willingham is now one of the most cited examples in the fight against the death penalty. His wrongful execution has led to widespread calls for criminal justice reform, particularly regarding the use of flawed forensic science in court. His story is a chilling reminder of how easily the system can fail, condemning an innocent person to death while allowing the real truth to remain buried. If the courts had listened to the growing body of evidence proving his innocence, if the Texas Board of Pardons had reviewed the expert reports before his execution, if the state had been more concerned with truth than with defending its own actions, Willingham might still be alive today. Instead, he was killed for a crime that never happened, a victim of bad science and a justice system that refused to correct its mistakes. Troy Davis, executed. Despite recanted testimonies and doubts, Troy Davis was executed in Georgia on September 21, 2011, despite overwhelming doubt about his guilt. His conviction was based almost entirely on eyewitness testimony, but in the years following his trial, nearly every key witness recanted, many stating that they had been pressured by police to testify against him. Despite national and international outcry, legal appeals failed to stop his execution, making his case one of the most controversial wrongful executions in modern history. The crime occurred in Savannah, Georgia, on August 19, 1989. Off-duty police officer Mark McPhail was shot and killed in a Burger King parking lot while trying to break up an altercation. Witnesses claimed that Troy Davis was the shooter, and he was arrested shortly after. The prosecution's case against him was built on witness testimony, as there was no physical evidence, no DNA, no fingerprints, and no murder weapon linking Davis to the crime. However, the testimonies were enough to convict him, and in 1991, he was sentenced to death. From the start, Davis maintained his innocence. He insisted that he had been wrongfully accused and that another man, Sylvester "Red" Coles, was the actual killer. Coles was one of the key witnesses against Davis, yet he was never thoroughly investigated. Over the years, as Davis sat on death row, his case began to unravel. By the early 2000s, 7 of the 9 witnesses who had testified against him at trial recanted their statements, many revealing that they had been pressured by police. Some admitted they had been threatened with jail time if they did not implicate Davis. Others said they had been too afraid to tell the truth during the original trial. Several witnesses directly pointed to Sylvester Coles as the real shooter, but their statements were largely ignored by the courts. As doubts about his guilt grew, Davis's case gained worldwide attention. Human rights organizations, legal experts, and even former U.S. government officials called for his execution to be halted. High-profile figures, including former President Jimmy Carter, Pope Benedict XVI, and Nobel laureate Desmond Tutu, pleaded with Georgia officials to grant him clemency. Even some of the original jurors who had convicted Davis publicly stated that they would not have sentenced him to death had they known about the recantations. Despite the mounting evidence casting doubt on his conviction, the legal system refused to grant Davis a new trial. His lawyers fought relentlessly to present new testimony and evidence, but courts repeatedly denied their appeals. In 2010, the U.S. Supreme Court ordered a rare evidentiary hearing, giving Davis an opportunity to prove his innocence. However, the burden of proof was placed entirely on him, and the judge ruled that he had not met the extraordinarily high standard required to overturn his conviction. As his execution date approached, protests erupted across the United States and beyond. Activists held vigils, celebrities spoke out, and thousands signed petitions urging Georgia officials to reconsider. Yet, the Georgia Board of Pardons and Paroles denied clemency, and his final appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court was rejected just hours before his scheduled execution. On the night of September 21, 2011, Troy Davis was strapped to a gurney at the Georgia Diagnostic and Classification Prison. Before receiving the lethal injection, he used his final words to once again assert his innocence. He addressed the McPhail family, expressing sympathy for their loss, but insisting that he was not responsible for the officer's death. His last words were, "I am innocent. The incident that happened that night was not my fault. I did not have a gun. I did not shoot your officer." His execution sparked outrage and renewed debates about the flaws in the U.S. justice system. Many legal experts argued that his case exemplified the dangers of relying on eyewitness testimony, especially when so many witnesses had later recanted. Others pointed to racial bias and systemic failures that led to his wrongful execution. Years after Davis's death, his case remains a powerful symbol of the risks of capital punishment. While some still defend the conviction, the overwhelming doubt surrounding his guilt has led many to believe that Georgia executed an innocent man. His story continues to fuel calls for criminal justice reform, especially regarding the reliability of witness testimony and the irreversible nature of the death penalty. Troy Davis, executed. Despite recanted testimonies and doubts, Troy Davis was executed in Georgia on September 21, 2011, despite overwhelming doubt about his guilt. His conviction was based almost entirely on eyewitness testimony, but in the years following his trial, nearly every key witness recanted, many stating that they had been pressured by police to testify against him. Despite national and international outcry, legal appeals failed to stop his execution, making his case one of the most controversial wrongful executions in modern history. The crime occurred in Savannah, Georgia, on August 19, 1989. Off-duty police officer Mark McPhail was shot and killed in a Burger King parking lot while trying to break up an altercation. Witnesses claimed that Troy Davis was the shooter, and he was arrested shortly after. The prosecution's case against him was built on witness testimony, as there was no physical evidence, no DNA, no fingerprints, and no murder weapon linking Davis to the crime. However, the testimonies were enough to convict him, and in 1991, he was sentenced to death. From the start, Davis maintained his innocence. He insisted that he had been wrongfully accused and that another man, Sylvester "Red" Coles, was the actual killer. Coles was one of the key witnesses against Davis, yet he was never thoroughly investigated. Over the years, as Davis sat on death row, his case began to unravel. By the early 2000s, 7 of the 9 witnesses who had testified against him at trial recanted their statements, many revealing that they had been pressured by police. Some admitted they had been threatened with jail time if they did not implicate Davis. Others said they had been too afraid to tell the truth during the original trial. Several witnesses directly pointed to Sylvester Coles as the real shooter, but their statements were largely ignored by the courts. As doubts about his guilt grew, Davis's case gained worldwide attention. Human rights organizations, legal experts, and even former U.S. government officials called for his execution to be halted. High-profile figures, including former President Jimmy Carter, Pope Benedict XVI, and Nobel laureate Desmond Tutu, pleaded with Georgia officials to grant him clemency. Even some of the original jurors who had convicted Davis publicly stated that they would not have sentenced him to death had they known about the recantations. Despite the mounting evidence casting doubt on his conviction, the legal system refused to grant Davis a new trial. His lawyers fought relentlessly to present new testimony and evidence, but courts repeatedly denied their appeals. In 2010, the U.S. Supreme Court ordered a rare evidentiary hearing, giving Davis an opportunity to prove his innocence. However, the burden of proof was placed entirely on him, and the judge ruled that he had not met the extraordinarily high standard required to overturn his conviction. As his execution date approached, protests erupted across the United States and beyond. Activists held vigils, celebrities spoke out, and thousands signed petitions urging Georgia officials to reconsider. Yet, the Georgia Board of Pardons and Paroles denied clemency, and his final appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court was rejected just hours before his scheduled execution. On the night of September 21, 2011, Troy Davis was strapped to a gurney at the Georgia Diagnostic and Classification Prison. Before receiving the lethal injection, he used his final words to once again assert his innocence. He addressed the McPhail family, expressing sympathy for their loss, but insisting that he was not responsible for the officer's death. His last words were, "I am innocent. The incident that happened that night was not my fault. I did not have a gun. I did not shoot your officer." His execution sparked outrage and renewed debates about the flaws in the U.S. justice system. Many legal experts argued that his case exemplified the dangers of relying on eyewitness testimony, especially when so many witnesses had later recanted. Others pointed to racial bias and systemic failures that led to his wrongful execution. Years after Davis's death, his case remains a powerful symbol of the risks of capital punishment. While some still defend the conviction, the overwhelming doubt surrounding his guilt has led many to believe that Georgia executed an innocent man. His story continues to fuel calls for criminal justice reform, especially regarding the reliability of witness testimony and the irreversible nature of the death penalty. Lena Baker, executed for defending herself. Lena Baker was the first and only woman to be executed in Georgia's electric chair. She was put to death in 1945 for the murder of a white man, even though she acted in self-defense. Decades later, the state of Georgia officially admitted she had been wrongfully convicted. Her case is a tragic example of racial injustice, gender bias, and a legal system that failed to protect a black woman in the segregated South. Born in 1901 in Cuthbert, Georgia, Lena Baker grew up in poverty, working as a sharecropper alongside her family. As a black woman in the Jim Crow South, she had few rights and even fewer opportunities. She worked as a maid and did other low-paying jobs to survive. In the early 1940s, she was hired by a white man named Ernest Knight, an older mill operator who had a reputation for violence and alcoholism. Knight frequently forced Baker to work for him, and their relationship quickly became abusive. He would lock her inside his house for days, refusing to let her leave. He was known for his violent temper, and many people in the town were aware of his mistreatment of Baker, but no one intervened. On the night of April 30th, 1944, Baker and Knight got into a physical altercation. According to Baker's later testimony, Knight had kidnapped her once again and threatened to kill her. In a desperate struggle, she grabbed his gun and shot him, killing him instantly. She did not run or try to hide the crime. Instead, she immediately turned herself in, claiming self-defense. Despite her account of what happened, Baker was arrested and charged with capital murder. In the deeply racist legal system of the time, her fate was almost sealed from the beginning. A black woman killing a white man, no matter the circumstances, was considered an unforgivable crime. Her trial lasted only one day. She was given a white, all-male jury, as black citizens were systematically excluded from juries in Georgia. Her defense attorney barely put up a fight, and the prosecution painted her as a cold-blooded killer rather than a woman trying to protect herself. The jury took less than a half hour to convict her, and she was sentenced to death. Baker's case quickly gained attention within her community, and many people, including black church leaders, protested her conviction. Her pastor and others pleaded for clemency, but the Georgia governor at the time refused to intervene. No legal appeals were granted, and the system moved forward with her execution. On March 5, 1945, Lena Baker was led to the electric chair at the Georgia State Prison. She remained calm, knowing she had done nothing wrong. Her last words were, "What I done, I did in self-defense, or I would have been killed myself. I am ready to meet my God." Moments later, she was executed. For decades, Baker's case was largely forgotten outside of her family and community. However, her relatives never stopped fighting to clear her name. In 2005, 60 years after her execution, the state of Georgia officially pardoned her, admitting that she had been wrongfully convicted. The Georgia Board of Pardons and Paroles acknowledged that she should never have been executed and that she had acted in self-defense. Her family held a formal ceremony to honor her, and a marker was placed at her gravesite to recognize the injustice she had suffered. Lena Baker's case is one of the most disturbing examples of racial and gender-based injustice in American history. She was executed not because she was guilty, but because she was a poor black woman in the Jim Crow South who dared to fight back against an abusive white man. Her wrongful conviction and execution highlight the failures of a legal system that for centuries denied justice to black Americans, particularly black women. Had she been given a fair trial, had her self-defense claim been taken seriously, and had the legal system valued her life as much as it valued the life of her abuser, Lena Baker would not have been executed. Instead, she became another victim of a system that protected white men at the expense of black women. Though her name has since been cleared, the injustice done to her can never truly be undone. George Stinney, Jr., the youngest person executed in the U.S. George Stinney, Jr. was just 14 years old when he was executed in 1944, making him the youngest person put to death in the United States in the 20th century. His conviction was based on a forced confession, an all-white jury, and a rushed trial that lasted less than a day. Decades later, he was exonerated, proving that the state of South Carolina had executed an innocent child. His case remains one of the most horrifying examples of racial injustice in American history. The crime that led to Stinney's conviction occurred on March 23, 1944, in the small town of Alcolu, South Carolina. Two white girls, 11-year-old Betty June Binnicker and 7-year-old Mary Emma Thames, were found brutally murdered in a ditch. They had been beaten to death with a railroad spike. The small segregated town was outraged, and the police quickly sought a suspect. George Stinney, Jr. and his younger sister, Amy, had reportedly seen the girls earlier in the day. That was enough for law enforcement to focus on him. The 14-year-old was arrested and interrogated without his parents, a lawyer, or any witnesses present. Just hours later, police claimed that Stinney had confessed to the murders, though no written or signed confession was ever presented. His trial took place just 1 month later, on April 24, 1944. It lasted barely 2 hours. Stinney's court-appointed attorney did not call a single witness in his defense and barely cross-examined the prosecution's case. The entire case against him was based on his alleged confession, even though there was no physical evidence linking him to the crime. No fingerprints, no weapon, no witnesses, just the word of the police. The jury, composed entirely of white men, deliberated for just 10 minutes before finding him guilty. The judge immediately sentenced him to death. There were no appeals, no delays, and no chance for a retrial. His parents were not even allowed to see him before his execution. On June 16, 1944, just 83 days after his arrest, George Stinney, Jr. was executed in the electric chair at the South Carolina State Penitentiary. The boy was so small, just 5 feet tall and weighing only 90 pounds, that the prison had to stack books on the chair so he could reach the electrodes. Witnesses reported that the first surge of electricity caused the mask covering his face to slip off, revealing his terrified expression as he was electrocuted. For decades, his case was largely forgotten, buried in the dark history of racial injustice in the Jim Crow South. However, in the early 2000s, new interest in the case emerged as activists and historians began pushing for a review of his conviction. His family, who had always maintained his innocence, worked tirelessly to clear his name. In 2014, 70 years after his execution, a South Carolina judge formally overturned George Stinney Jr.'s conviction. The judge ruled that Stinney had been denied a fair trial and that his confession had likely been coerced. The ruling stated that his constitutional rights had been violated and that his trial had been a great injustice. Despite his exoneration, the fact remains that the state of South Carolina executed an innocent child. His case is a chilling reminder of how quickly the justice system can fail, especially for Black Americans during segregation. Had he been given a proper defense, had his confession not been coerced, and had the court taken time to review the evidence, George Stinney Jr. might have lived a full life. Instead, he was sent to the electric chair at just 14 years old, an innocent boy sacrificed to a system that was never meant to protect him. Claude Jones, executed based on a single hair. Claude Jones was executed in Texas in 2000 for a murder he may not have committed. His conviction rested on a single piece of physical evidence, a strand of hair that prosecutors claimed placed him at the crime scene. Years later, DNA testing proved that the hair did not belong to him, raising the grim possibility that Texas executed an innocent man. His case underscores the dangers of relying on weak forensic evidence and the irreversible consequences of the death penalty. The crime took place on November 14, 1989, in Point Blank, Texas. A liquor store owner, Alan Hilzendager, was shot and killed during a robbery. Witnesses saw two men flee the scene in a car, but no one could clearly identify them. The case remained unsolved until police arrested Claude Jones, a known criminal with a history of robbery, along with two other men, Timothy Jordan and Kerry Dixon. The prosecution's case against Jones relied primarily on two things: testimony from an alleged accomplice and a strand of hair found at the crime scene. Timothy Jordan, in exchange for a lighter sentence, testified that Jones had been the triggerman. However, Jordan later recanted, stating that he had been coerced into making his statement. The other major piece of evidence was a single strand of hair found on the store counter. At the time, forensic experts claimed that the hair matched Jones, leading the jury to believe that he had been at the crime scene. Jones maintained his innocence throughout his trial, insisting that he was not the killer. However, his prior criminal record made him an easy target. The jury found him guilty, and he was sentenced to death. Despite numerous appeals, courts upheld his conviction, largely because of the hair evidence, which was considered the key forensic proof linking him to the crime. As his execution date approached, Jones's attorneys fought to have DNA testing conducted on the hair. They argued that modern forensic techniques could provide a definitive answer about whether Jones had been at the crime scene. However, Texas courts and then-Governor George W. Bush refused to allow the testing. On December 7, 2000, Jones was executed by lethal injection. He never confessed, going to his death, insisting that he had been wrongly convicted. Years later, in 2010, the Innocence Project and other legal groups successfully petitioned to have the hair tested using DNA technology that had not been available at the time of Jones's trial. The results were shocking. The hair did not belong to Jones at all. Instead, it belonged to the victim, Alan Hilzendager. This meant that the primary piece of forensic evidence used to convict Jones was completely unreliable. Had the courts allowed DNA testing before his execution, Jones might have been exonerated. The case reignited debates over the use of forensic science in death penalty cases, particularly in Texas, a state known for its high rate of executions. Critics argued that the justice system had failed by refusing to halt Jones's execution when clear doubts existed about his guilt. Jones's wrongful execution remains one of the most disturbing examples of how flawed forensic evidence can send an innocent person to death row. It serves as a stark reminder that the death penalty is irreversible. Once carried out, there is no way to correct the mistake. Had the state of Texas prioritized truth over finality, had the courts allowed DNA testing in time, and had prosecutors not relied on faulty forensic methods, Claude Jones might still be alive today. Instead, he became another victim of a system that failed to ensure justice before carrying out the ultimate punishment.